so excited to be here with y'all and be hanging out virtually this morning. So I'm going to share my screen really quick. All right. So in so many life situations, I would be really hard pressed to call myself a daring person. It has been really fun to prepare and think about this talk and really go back to the very beginning. So as you can see here on the left, this is a photo that is kind of the aftermath of one of the first times that I tried to do something that I thought was really daring. So I was in the 5th grade, and my sister and I were riding bikes outside of our family's childhood home in Iowa City. My sister had just gone up the neighbor's driveway and come down and stuck her leg up over one of her handlebars. So of course I had to try to outdo her. And this was the era of that Pepsi commercial where there was a little girl who was dancing at a table and singing ba 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 ba. And so my sister and I were obsessed with that commercial. So it's oh my gosh, I'm gonna do that commercial while coming down this hill, and I'm gonna totally outdo her. So I'm up at the top and I'm starting to wave my hand up in the air, and halfway down my bike just goes sliding out from under me, and I fly in the air and come crashing down and slam both my arms into the curb. And 2 days later, find out that I had broken both of my wrists after going on orchestra tour, as you see envisioned here. So first attempt to be really daring really did not go over so well. A few decades later, my family was on vacation in Egypt, and the touristy thing that you can do outside the pyramids is to ride camels. I'm not a super adventurous, daring person. I wasn't really feeling it, but I was okay, fine, I'll do it. And my dad happened to catch a photo of me right as the camel was standing up. So evidence number 2, I'm just really not a super daring person in most day-to-day life situations. I kind of tend toward the anxious. I'm afraid of falling, and it's just not super comfortable for me to take big dares out in the world. But where dare really does enter the picture for me is mostly through the realm of my creative work. As you heard, I am the host of a radio show and podcast called Embodied, and it is a show about sex, relationships, and health, and the radio version airs at noon in the middle of the day. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with Embodied, I just wanted to play this little trailer to get you acquainted. So this is the trailer for the 2nd season of our podcast.
Ever since I've been hosting Embodied, I walk around all day with voices in my head.
I can kind of just drag it out because sex just doesn't happen. So it's kind of funny how people, when I do end up disclosing my status to them, the reactions of oh, so that's why.
These voices make me think about who I am, how I navigate the world.
All of us that live long enough will know what it means to live through a disabled body.
And they're good company to have at times when I have to work extra hard just to feel normal.
Anita, people are really jerking off 24/7, especially during the pandemic, and they're not going to stop anytime soon.
I know I'm going to live with these voices for a long time, and I love that.
All right, so there is a little flavor of Embodied. And when I started Embodied, it was as a series as part of the State of Things, which was a statewide daily talk show that aired up until the end of last year. And when the State of Things ended, we spun off Embodied into its own standalone show. And on that show, we talk about the body and how it intersects with the world in a huge variety of ways, everything from what it's like to get a vasectomy, to what it's like to be in a relationship while navigating a terminal illness, to sex toy design and how to make sex toys more accessible for folks with disabilities, And when I tell people about the work that I do, people often tell me that I am brave and daring. And honestly, for such a long time, as I've said, it's been really hard for me to take that in because I've never really associated myself with this word. I also don't feel like what I'm doing is half as daring as what the folks who come on the show do, because it's my job to be in public and talk on the airwaves, and it's not theirs. But what I've learned through all of my creative work in the past decade or so is that daring is not a state of being, but it's really a practice. It's something that you can work at, something that you can feel into and really embody one day and not so much the next. And so the version of the word daring that resonates the most with me is having the boldness to try. I am that kid in high school who turned every English paper in with alliteration in the title. It's just how my brain works. So what I'm going to talk with y'all about today is what I want to call my boldness backpack. And these are the things that I carry with me, literally or metaphorically, that make me feel bold enough to try, even on the days when it feels really scary to do anything at all, let alone something that feels like a big risk. So the first thing that goes in this boldness backpack and definitely stays in no matter what is a bold lipstick. When I first got the opportunity to host live radio in the summer of 2017, I spent like a solid 3 weeks deep cleaning my house. I was just fueled by this anxiety that I was going to get on the radio and say something ridiculous or accidentally swear or do something that was going to get me, banned from radio forever. So I decided I was going to fuel all my energy into deep cleaning my house. I went to the end of the internet, learning about how to shine wood floors. I researched how you really clean your yoga mat. And I did all of that. I touched every surface. And then I started to organize all my cupboards. And I realized that I had this really impressive collection of bold lipsticks. And it ended up being those lipsticks that really got me through that first summer on the radio. I am a petite person. You can't tell here, but I'm like 5'2", and I have a relatively young looking face. So people underestimate how old I am and really underestimate the experience that I bring to the table. And that would happen to me a lot when I was hosting. Someone would walk in the room and say something like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize you were going to be so young," or during an interview kind of mention something like, "Well, there's no way you remember that. It was way before your time." And all of that stirs up a deep, deep rage, but that rage was not really healthy to sit in while trying to conduct a live interview. So I decided that I was going to start donning some kind of pop-in lipstick as a way of showing to both myself and to others that not only did I belong, but I was just going to do the damn thing with some pizzazz. So at first, and sometimes still, putting on that bold lip before an interview is kind of my symbolic permission to go for it, to shove out the imposter syndrome, to lean into the reality that I am meant to be there. And I think that asking questions that feel uncomfortable and pushing back and creating space for different kinds of voices requires courage. And for me, having that edgy exterior mobilizes me to have the courage to do things a little bit differently. If that idea resonates with you, your red lipstick need not be an actual red lipstick. But if it is, hit me up because I've done some deep research and I'm happy to share my recommendations. So in there, squashed in between a dozen lipsticks, are all of the people that I've had on Embodied. Their stories and energy and vulnerability really beget my own. I think that good narrative journalism is empathy building, but it's also an avenue for really questioning power and norms and destabilizing assumptions. People that have come on Embodied have been so bold. They've been bold enough to talk about abortion, infertility, STIs, grief, and really dig deep into some of these conversations that we think of as off limits, talking about sexual pleasure, talking about sex work, talking about nudity, and so much more. And I think that my ability to get on the radio and start a conversation about a topic, even after getting some negative feedback or pushback, is in large part because of the courage of the folks that I speak to, the courage that I witness in them. And there are so many moments and conversations that really stick with me. But I want to share an excerpt from some of the conversations that people ask me the most about. So as part of the podcast, I have my parents on to talk about whatever topic we're talking about. And before doing Embodied, I really never talked to my parents about sex at all. They never gave me the sex talk. It was a topic we just never broached. But I decided to talk about this for the first time with them with microphones rolling. So I want to share an excerpt now that mashes up two of the conversations that we have had about sex. The first was about sex and pleasure, and I asked them why they never gave me the sex talk. And the second was asking them about their experiences with porn. So I am going to share my slides again here, and we will do a little listen.
Go for it, Dad.
I think it is very much a cultural thing. If I had to learn about sex when I was growing up, it was almost impossible.
My parents also didn't tell me anything. No sex talk, period, nothing. I think we didn't do, if it's one area where we were lacking, we were totally lacking in that area. Because we did not have the example that it was something we didn't talk about.
If you could have the sex talk today, how would you start the conversation?
I think you would really talk first by explaining how a human is actually conceived.
I've heard about the magazines. You've seen that in the stores. But apart from that, I have not been exposed to porn. I mean, I've not looked for it. I'm not interested. Oh, you know what? I'm telling a complete lie. This is kind of random, but this is the only exposure I've had. Dad asked me to go to a shop in Iowa City to get something because he wanted to. Do you remember that, Satish?
Yes.
So I totally have been inside a store, but for an errand for Dad, for a medical-related errand.
For a medical-related errand?
That was it.
Dad, any reflections?
So I think my first exposure to porn was in England. This is our small group of friends, about half a dozen of us. We prepared for the exams, and fortunately we all passed. And so the way we wanted to celebrate was to go and watch a porn movie. And that's what we did.
You did? I didn't know this.
Yeah, I never told you.
Wow.
and so on. And that was my first and last true experience to actual porn itself. I don't think I've had much exposure.
Okay. So those are my parents, total gems. And I really learned so much from having these conversations with them. It's sometimes more difficult to get them to open up about topics than other things, but I think that their willingness to be open with me and share things that they haven't shared with me before has taught me so much about the practice of having difficult conversations, and that it really is a practice. And I think that to do so, to have these conversations well, it's really important to set the table, to make sure everyone has a sense of why you're having this conversation, what your intentions are when you're talking about sensitive topics, and being really clear about that to make sure that everyone feels safe and respected kind of entering this series of kind of engaging back and forth. And talking with them about challenging stuff is also a constant reminder to me that so much creative work is relational. It's not just about you, but it's about who you're creating for and creating with. And the strongest interviews to me are the ones that really are a conversation, that are a back and forth, and are ones where people feel comfortable setting, stating, and respecting each other's boundaries. And I think that comfort and security are really essential foundations for anything daring. Even though they may seem like words that are actually the opposite of dare, I think they're really important foundations to feel like you make folks comfortable enough to take risks. So the next thing sliding into my backpack next to my parents and my lipsticks, that in so many ways gives me the boldness to try is curiosity. Curiosity, I think, is the antithesis of judgment. It opens neural pathways, it opens opportunities for connection, while judgment really shuts things down. Judgment shuts down energy and enthusiasm and spark. And keeping a healthy sense of curiosity about how I work and why I'm doing what I'm doing, when there's an opportunity for growth and when it's really time to rest, has been the key to a creative adventure full of risks. I think that staying present and connected with creative work for me means finding ways to connect back to my curiosity whenever I'm feeling lost or feeling drained. My road to journalism was a little bit winding. I took a bit of a detour in college, got really into women's studies and oral history work. And that work did really build the intellectual foundation for a lot of the things that I do now, but it also introduced me to some of the most incredible professors and folks who taught me so much about creativity. And one of my college professors gave me some of the best creative advice that I still follow to this day. She said that whenever she's feeling uninspired or in a rut, she shuts off her phone, she drives to the closest local toy store, and she just spends 30 minutes just wandering around, just taking in that universe filled with play and color and surprise. And I really think about that all the time and kind of try to find my own versions of that toy store, that fully immersive experience that really takes me out of my head. And sometimes it's reading a book of fiction or playing imaginary ice cream shop with my 3-year-old nephew. It's just about finding ways back to myself and connecting with that kind of innate curiosity that drives so much of what I do. I think that coming back to this curiosity is my way of staying in a space where daring feels interesting and not paralyzing. So the last thing in that backpack that I realize is kind of 90% metaphor, 10% lipstick, is embracing failure. Making a mistake on or off the radio takes me really far out of my comfort zone. I've certainly made a few handfuls of mistakes in my experience on the air, and making those mistakes feels terrible. It feels so much worse than breaking both my wrists or trying to ride a camel in Egypt. I think because when you're doing creative work that's vulnerable and that holds space for the vulnerability of others, making a mistake feels really awful. And I think that in my daring journey and my process of practicing boldness, embracing failure is really still where I am working. It's an ongoing effort, something my therapist would probably call my growth edge. And it really is, because I don't like letting other people or myself down. But as I realize with each show that I do or conversation that I have, I think that the skills that you build in the wake of failure really strengthen your resilience and strengthen your ability to take those risks. Learning how to apologize and working to do better and minimize harm and accept feedback. And then also knowing when to stop looking at the comment section are all really, really important steps in any creative journey. I did a little poll on Instagram earlier this week asking people about their personal definitions of dare. And I got so much back from that I really loved. Some folks said to want more and unabashedly seek it, to tip the scale just enough toward courage over fear, to be scared shitless, but do it anyway. And I think that all of these are amazing and really bring me back to the idea that daring is a practice, and it's one that's made easier if you arm yourself with tools that bring you back to yourself, that bring you back to your intentions and your values, and that keep you grounded in what energizes and inspires you. I think that doing that will help you get back out there, take risks, and do all of that even when it doesn't feel easy to do so. For me, the tools that really help me dare are those things that fill that backpack. Lipstick, building from the vulnerability of others, curiosity, and a healthy relationship with failure. All of those things really give me the strength and the spark to try. Thank you so much.
Let's give a big round of applause. Please unmute yourself and help me. Thank you, Anita. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Anita. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that talk, Anita. I would love to open up the floor for questions. So if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. You could also raise your hand like we did earlier, and we can spotlight you so you can actually ask your question directly to Anita. I will get started though. You were just talking about failure and embracing that. This is kind of putting you on the spot, but could you speak to a time recently where you felt that sense of failure and talk about how you came out of it?
Yeah. I think that with a lot of the topics that we have in Embodied, they're really personal to people, and people feel a great sense of risk sharing their stories, especially when journalists haven't necessarily held those stories in the most sensitive way in the past. And so I think it's kind of a constant reminder for us that we're pushing back against all of the things that journalists have maybe done in an insensitive way before. So any kind of unintentional mistake on our end, like a scheduling kerfuffle or accidentally missing an interview or not including someone, like the entirety of someone's interview because we needed to edit it down for content purposes, like all those things that to us seem like, oh, these are just parts of like an editorial process, can really not feel that way to folks whose stories have been misused or misrepresented for a really long time. And I think I've learned a lot about kind of caring for the entirety of a relationship with a guest, and learn from mistakes where folks have felt like we didn't do that, where we didn't explain our process to them as well as we could have. And it wasn't anything intentional to hurt their feelings or to minimize their story. But it can really come across that way when you're not used to kind of being treated well in the media. So I think with Embodied, one of the things that's been really lovely is we're on one time a week, which it is still a lot, but it's less than in media world than like a daily show. So we have a little bit more time to cultivate those deeper relationships and follow back with people and explain our process a little more. So making some of those mistakes where we've kind of hurt people's feelings by some of the choices we've made and not known how to explain ourselves. Those have been some kind of recent failures and mistakes that we've learned from.
That's a great answer. And I think that's so universal. I mean, just thinking, you hear the customer journey, in other fields. So it's really just thinking about the people you're working with and thinking of stepping back and thinking of the whole picture.
Totally.
Who else has questions? Like I said, please raise your hand or pop something in the chat. In the meantime, Anita, what is the most memorable or maybe unbelievable interview that you've ever done?
Question is so hard. There are some interviews that I've really geeked out about. I got to interview Ann Patchett a few years ago, who's an author that I really, really admire. And it's so hard to interview people who've been interviewed so many times because you want to stand out and you want to do something different. You want to have a different kind of conversation, but you don't know exactly, whether you're going to be able to do it. And she said something at the very end of the interview, like we were about to hang up and I was like very trying to be mindful of her time. And she said, like, I also just want to let you know that like you did a really good job. Like that was a really nice interview. And I have that like little audio file saved on my computer. And sometimes I just press play when I'm having a hard day. So that interview is like, sticks with me more so because of like the importance of kind of that connection that we had, and being able to develop a connection in an interview with someone who's practiced at doing interviews can be really hard. So that one stands out to me as one that I remember.
Oh, great answer. And I love that you saved that little clip. I have things like that too, where it's like, okay, I can go back to this and it makes me feel good. And then I can.
Exactly.
So we have a question from Joel. Have there been any unexpected topics you've decided to cover that have come from us living in a pandemic for a year and a half?
Good question. Let's see. I think it's definitely changed in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I think it's changed some of the conversations that we have because our topics are a little bit more evergreen. So they're not necessarily like right on the news, but kind of about how people's lives intersect with, sometimes intersect with the news in like a more remote way. But one of the things that we're actually talking about, we recorded our show yesterday, it's coming out next week, is about 24-hour childcare centers. And that was a topic that was in a lot of ways inspired by the pandemic and how much the pandemic has really illuminated the childcare crisis in this country, and the fact that essential workers who still need to report to work needed a place to send their kids. And so there's a handful of facilities around the country that are open 24 hours a day for people who do shift work or work multiple jobs. So that's one of the topics that I think was definitely became more relevant to us because of the pandemic. I'm trying to think about others. We're definitely trying to find, we try to find ways to keep our conversations very narrative driven. So we've thought about doing conversations about misinformation and like vaccine hesitancy and that kind of thing, but are really trying to find ways to do those that are grounded in personal stories. So it's definitely brought up a lot of ideas, but I can't think of any others we're working on right now that are explicitly related to the pandemic. But obviously it's shaped all of our lives and our relationships with our bodies in a lot of ways. So it comes up in almost every interview.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned that you had the new episode coming out last week, and I noticed that you just started a couple weeks ago. Can you just speak to the second season?
Yeah, so we actually moved to releasing the podcast every single week. We used to have a seasonal model where we would kind of take the best of the radio shows and turn them into podcasts. And now we're turning around podcasts every single week because folks kind of wanted that. So there's no more seasons in the podcast that we're doing. You can actually hear the same content you would hear on the radio at noon. An edited down version of that show is available on your podcast feed later that day. So we're calling it Season Forever because it's, there's no end in sight. We're turning around all of the shows for the podcast.
Awesome. So all of y'all, you can find Embodied on all of your podcast platforms.
Yeah, certainly.
All right, we do have a question from Lisa. Lisa, would you like to speak up or would you like me to ask your question? Okay. So how did you originally initiate your series on NPR? What was the proposal or catalyst? And follow up, what gave you the brilliant idea to incorporate your parents?
Yeah, great questions. So the original idea was really from just feeling like a lot of the conversations that I was having with my friends and folks in my community were not reflected on the public radio that we were consuming, and wanting to kind of find a space for those conversations and for those topics that we thought were really important to kind of be taken seriously with that same level of journalistic curiosity and integrity as everything else. So it kind of came from noticing an absence and giving myself, I had that opportunity to host live for a month. Frank Stasio, the former host of The State of Things, started taking these month-long vacations to Buffalo, to summer in Buffalo. And so I had the opportunity to host. So with that opportunity and kind of noticing the absence, I was like, okay, what if I just try this as an experiment, see what happens if we put topics like this on the radio, and end up going well. And we really enjoyed what we were doing and got a lot of great feedback. And so it kind of just evolved from there. And the incorporating my parents. So my mom, I mean, they're radio gold. They just say like the funniest things and their dynamic is just so funny. And I had my mom, a good friend, Sandra Davidson, and I did a podcast called She and Her for 5 years. And we had our moms on that podcast really often. That podcast was about millennial feminism in the South. And we had intergenerational conversations with them all the time about our experiences as women and their experiences as women. And it was so fun and a really beautiful way for me to kind of connect with my mom in a new way doing that podcast. And so that kind of planted the initial seed. But the real reason was that I had a conversation with Anna Sale, who's a podcast host of Death, Sex, and Money, in the lead up to doing Embodied. And she is that kind of interviewer who you're trying to interview her and she turns it back on you. And so I was trying to interview her and she turned it back on me. And she said, like, why are you the one having these conversations? Like, why should people be listening to you? How are you making yourself vulnerable? And that was a big moment of kind of revelation and realization for me that, you know, I'm very comfortable in the interviewer role and I'm not as comfortable kind of revealing more of myself or interrogating my own stories publicly. And so talking to my parents was kind of that way of challenging myself to do that a little bit more, to engage more personally with some of these topics. And it became such a cool way to really like get to know them as people, not just as my parents, and like discovering all kinds of things about them that I would have had no idea about if I hadn't asked them those questions with microphones rolling. So it's been super fun.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then kind of following up on your parents, we have a question from David around, you know, could you or do you have these conversations with your parents outside of the podcast?
Certainly. Yes, I certainly do. And there have been some really interesting learning moments too, of when I talked about that idea of setting the table. There have been a couple of moments where we did an episode about abortion. And I always tell my parents, like, okay, I'm like, we're going to talk about these 3 topics today for these upcoming episodes. And I think like my mom, their interpretation of what we were going to talk about when we talked about abortion was not what I was thinking we were going to talk about. And so the microphones were rolling and I started asking them about their experience, like when they chose to get an abortion. And it really caught my mom off guard, especially. And so we had this really interesting moment while microphones were rolling that I then was like, okay, we need to talk more about this. Not with microphones rolling, because there's clearly like a lot to flesh out and some stuff that can't necessarily be fleshed out in a podcast public format. So for sure, David, like some of the topics have inspired more conversations off the microphone, or now off the microphone conversations are inspiring conversations on the microphone. So it's definitely opened up more levels and layers of communication.
That's a great answer. And it is so fascinating to, you know, you're talking about these, you know, almost like taboo topics. So it's like, what makes them too taboo to share on public radio? And yeah, I think having that conversation with your parents is like a very easy way to draw a line. Maybe easier to draw that line than with someone else, you know, that you're interviewing.
Totally.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. So any tips for letting go of fear and judgment? This is from Katie, and she says, specifically thinking back to when you were initially entering the wellness space.
Yeah. Tips for letting go of the fear and judgment. I think inviting in curiosity. So like when you notice judgmental thoughts from yourself or others, just kind of turning to why, like, tell me more about why you feel that way, or like, why is it starting to feel uncomfortable to talk about for you? Or like, why do you think we've never had this conversation before? Like taking a moment to step back from like the immediate thing you're trying to talk about and get curious about the discomfort and start there and kind of unpack that. I think that is huge. Like, yeah, the idea of kind of curiosity is the antithesis to judgment. I think it can really help when you feel like things are shutting down and locking down. I think that a lot of people, one of the things I talked about with Blakely before doing this was that one of the biggest kind of pieces of feedback or criticism we get for Embodied is that like these conversations shouldn't be had in the middle of the day. Like, okay, you want to talk about sex, like put the show at 10 p.m. And I think that a lot of that idea is wrapped up in this kind of fear and judgment, that like any conversation about sex is inherently salacious, is inherently taboo. And so sometimes it's just like naming it and talking about it and continuing to talk about it kind of encourages people to start hearing you beyond that initial like bristle and let go of a little bit of that fear and judgment. So part of it, it's also just practice, I think, practice talking about it yourself and getting curious about your own, the things that you're bristling about and why you might be feeling that way.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's do one more question. This one's from Mandy. What helped you move forward comfortably in these conversations with your parents after growing up in an environment where they weren't really talked about?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's nothing like a deadline to inspire just getting the mics rolling. So sometimes it would feel like I would definitely put off the parent part of it sometimes until the end, because I would be like, how am I going to do this? Or what's the best question? Or like, how am I going to find a way to get into this that's going to feel good? So I think what's helped me is sharing a lot with them about the feedback that we get from their presence on the podcast, and that people feel really excited to hear from them and feel really inspired to have their own conversations with their parents and feel like more curious about asking their parents about things. I think that has been huge and really empowering for them to like feel like what they're doing is having kind of a greater impact. And that's helped me kind of move toward more comfort too, of realizing that like having intergenerational conversations about these topics, I feel like is so important for breaking down some of those silos where, you know, if I feel like the things my community and my friends are talking about are not necessarily reflected on public radio, then public radio audience is like much older and whiter than my friend group. So how do I like bridge that gap? And I think having intergenerational conversations is a big way toward that. So realizing what the silos are and where the breakdowns of communication are, I think has helped me move toward wanting to do that more.
Yeah, fantastic. And you can tell your parents that they had a lot of great feedback here. Lots of comments in the chat after you shared.
I will.
All right. Well, let's do one more big thank you to Anita. You all can unmic and just thank you again. Wonderful talk. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Anita.
So much.
Awesome.